conditions women endured at the end of the 19th century would be inconceivable today. Women couldn't vote, they couldn't own property, and they couldn't open bank accounts. Single women were property of their fathers or brothers, and married women were property of their husbands. Those husbands too often spent their evenings drinking away their paychecks while their wives lived deplorable lives. And as we're about to see, it was this drunkenness and abuse that gave birth to the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And it was this that was the springboard to the women's movement in Canada.
Charlotte Gray is the author of Nellie McClung, Extraordinary Canadian, which describes life for McClung and all women near the end of the 1800s.
In the late 19th century, alcohol was a complete curse of in Canada and in the United States. Drunkenness was rife, and women often found themselves in terrible situations where they had children and a husband who drank away all the profits from the farm or were physically abusive, and they had no recourse. This was the world she grew up in. And yet, at the same time, where she grew up in Manitoba, women were working alongside men, building these communities, establishing farms on land that had never been farmed before, working the same hours as their husbands, working just as hard, suffering the same poverty, the same reverses. And yet they didn't have an equal voice in how those communities should develop.
McClung wanted more from life than working on her family's farm. She was captivated by books and became a teacher at 16. She worked until she was married at the age of 23. Children soon followed, and although Nellie enjoyed motherhood, she couldn't shake her dream of becoming a writer.
She started collecting stories. At first she was collecting stories to write up for a magazine that in fact never actually appeared. But she loved walking off and interviewing people in the farms around Manitou and hearing their stories. And that was one way she learned about the reality of women's lives, because she would sit in the kitchen of some farm. It was a very welcoming society where people really looked out for each other. Sometimes the farmer's wife would be a happy woman with a healthy child and the farm was going well. But she saw so many unhappy women who had too many children around them. There was no birth control. And birth control was a completely verboten subject. It was one of the taboo subjects in Victorian Canada. A woman with too many children, her health broken, a husband who had put all his money into farm animals rather than any improvements in the house at all. And a woman exhausted, sick, struggling to survive. And Nellie saw it all.
But women then were virtually paralyzed. Few rights, no access to courts, and almost no chance to improve their lot. They turned to the church. Christian temperance unions were already attempting to ban alcohol. The women who joined the organization soon realized prohibiting alcohol wasn't the only change they were after. If life was going to improve, they needed a voice, and for it to be heard, they needed the right to vote.
Nellie was not the only early feminist in Canada. Many other women had been working for a couple of decades to get the issue of getting women the vote into the sort of public debate. But Nellie, as soon as she entered the movement, was the one everybody wanted to listen to. She was such a good public speaker. Once she got involved in the temperance movement, she started meeting other women with more radical ideas. And she also started traveling to Winnipeg, where there was a group that had moved on from the temperance battle to actually arguing that women should have the vote. Winnipeg was a city with a large number of immigrants, new Canadians, and they were working in sort of factories and sweatshops in the most dreadful conditions, appalling sort of damp basements, no safety or health regulations at all. And when she saw this, she thought something must be done. Nellie was a real something must be done person. And she went and very sweetly, in the most demure way possible, she and a colleague went and invited the Premier, Redmond Roblin, to tour these sweatshops with her. And the Premier didn't know what had hit him. I mean, he just thought these were two nice middle-class ladies who were going to show him some sights. And he said, of course I'll come with you. And they got into his big fat limousine. And he was busy saying things like, well, women just work for pin money. And where these women come from, conditions are much worse. They are lucky to have these jobs. And Nellie marched him down into a couple of these sort of basement sweatshops. And he turned white. The smell was overpowering. A couple of the women were actually sick and incredibly poor health. And he sort of staggered out and said, why would a nice woman like you bother with something like that?
It seems Conservative Premier Roblin cared as much about women winning the right to vote as he did about the women in those basement sweatshops. In other words, not at all. But using an approach that was entertaining and effective, the women in Manitoba pressed on. They held their own mock parliament with women in power and men not having the right to vote. They called it the Women's Parliament.
The suffrage supporters had their absolutely strongest speaker ever, Nellie McClung, to play the part of the male premier. And it wasn't just any male premier. She had watched Redmond Roblin in action. She had sort of absolutely learnt his body language. I mean, he was a sort of pompous old windbag, and he used to sort of stick his thumbs in his vest pocket and bounce up and down on his feet and just be incredibly patronizing. And she'd studied all this.
The success of this approach was revealed by what happened next.
What it really did was it destroyed Roblin's credibility. This event was actually just before an election in which he, in other circumstances, probably would have had a huge majority.
She got members of the Liberal Party to say that if they formed the next government, they would bring in the votes for women. And so a few months later, Roblin did lose an election, and the Liberals introduced both temperance and women's suffrage, and Manitoba became the first province in which women could vote. That was in 1916, but the story of justice for women didn't end there. In 1927, Nellie received a call from a close friend.
Emily Murphy, who's another incredibly strong, forceful Alberta woman, calls Nellie to help her on what we now call the Persons Case. The Persons Case dealt with the fact that women were considered eligible to sit in the Federal Senate in Ottawa, because it did not specifically say in the British North America Act of 1867 that women could sit there. It just referred to men. And they were determined that if women could now sit in the House of Commons and if women had the vote, of course they also had access to the upper house. And so these 5 women put together a case arguing that women should be considered persons, just the same as men, and they took it to the Supreme Court of Canada. And shockingly, the Supreme Court of Canada said, no, we have to interpret the law absolutely very narrowly, and women are not eligible.
That verdict incensed not only members of the women's movement, but supporters of the movement, including some powerful men. One of the people who supported the women who became known as the Famous Five was Prime Minister Mackenzie King. With financial support from King, the women embarked on a trip to the Privy Council in London, England. The Supreme Court of Canada was overruled. In 1929, women were declared persons. While some people thought the decision ended the fight for equality, it didn't.
Nellie McClung herself always knew that this was part of a larger picture, a larger struggle towards a more egalitarian society where everybody could contribute and benefit equally.
Clearly, everyone is not yet treated equally, and when it comes to equality for women, the struggle continues. But Nellie McClung was the first, a pioneer, an enduring example of this fact. True and lasting change to our society almost always starts with ordinary citizens who champion a cause and simply refuse to stop until they succeed.